Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily. Today is Thursday, September 12th, 2024. On today's episode of the show, we're going to be talking about Alex Gibney's new two-part documentary, Wise Guy, David Chase and the Sopranos, and then we'll present an interview with Alex Gibney. My name is Ben Pearson. I'm an editor at slashfilm.com, and I'm joined on today's episode by Slash Film editor and chief film critic, Chris Evangelista.
Hello.
All right, so heads up to our listeners. This conversation is going to include spoilers for Wise Guy as well as for all of The Sopranos. So just saying that up front, if you've not watched the show, check it out. I watched it for the first time a couple years ago, and it is tremendous. So actually, that's how I wanted to start this conversation, Chris. What is your relationship to The Sopranos?
I love The Sopranos. I think it's one of the best TV shows of all time. I watched it when it aired, and I actually rewatched it a few years ago, and I actually went back and rewatched it again probably last year, I want to say. I watched it from beginning to end. And good show. Show really holds up. It's probably even better than I remember it being. Like, I don't think I appreciated it as much as I appreciate it now when it was airing. It's the show that sort of like invented the peak TV era. And I do think people don't understand how much of a TV show it is. I have a review of The Penguin dropping today, the new HBO show. And it's fair to say that show was influenced by The Sopranos in a way. It's about a morally reprehensible character who's also a mobster, and he even has mommy issues in the show, just like Tony Soprano. But the problem with The Penguin that I had is it's very much structured like an 8-hour movie, and a lot of TV shows now, and whatever you want to call the era of TV we're in now, are structured like this. So they're structured as like one long movie, and I'm genuinely sick of this because it's bad. There are exceptions to the rule. I do think you can make a TV show of that format that works. There have been some examples, but overall, TV is an episodic medium, and The Sopranos is an episodic show. Like, yes, every season has an overarching story that you can follow from beginning to end of the season, but every episode is structured like an episode. Every episode has a clear beginning, middle, and end. It's like a 3-act structure, if you will. And I feel like a lot of people don't really remember that. And like, I feel like they think of it as being part of this era where everything is structured like one long movie. And I'm sorry, I don't want to watch an 8-hour movie. When I watch a TV show, I want it to be a TV show. And the reason Sopranos works so well is because it has memorable episodes. Like, there are so many episodes you can point to as being like, that's a great episode of The Sopranos. And something like The Penguin, there's not a single episode of that show that I would say like that was a memorable episode, because it's just telling this one long, drawn out story. And I kind of miss that. I feel like TV has gotten away from that. I guess I like the streaming era kind of made this happen, because so many people binge their TV shows now. They watch it all in one sitting, and that's bad. I want it to be. If you want to make a good TV show, look at The Sopranos, look at Mad Men, look at Breaking Bad. These are all shows that are considered some of the best shows ever made, and they're all very episodic. And I feel like people have forgotten that.
Yeah, I think you can look at those shows and say, oh, remember that episode where not just this happened, but like that one episode that was formally daring or like visually interesting in a way that stood out from other episodes of the show. And a lot of the stuff, I think, I'm trying to not paint with too broad of a brush, but I think it's fair to say that generally speaking, a lot of the streaming stuff we see, I guess the visuals or the formal elements of what we're seeing, the actual filmmaking going on in terms of constructing these TV episodes doesn't change very much from episode to episode. So things kind of blur together a little bit. But yeah, back in these older shows, you had, I think it helps too that like David Chase comes from, and this documentary gets into this, comes from writing on shows like the Rockford Files, and like had that history of like churning out episode after episode of those older TV shows that had a much more rigid structure than the streaming stuff that we watch now. So I guess that's a good transition point into some general thoughts about this doc, and then we can maybe get into like some least favorite moments or favorite moments that we had from it. But broadly speaking, what did you think about the 2-episode Wise Guy: David Chase and The Sopranos?
I liked it overall. I wanted more. I just feel like the show is so rich and there's so much history with the show, and you like, and I'm so into the show in general. I kind of wish it was like it went into more of the show itself. Matt Zoller-Seitz and Alan Sepinwall published this really great book called The Sopranos Sessions, which literally walks through the entire series from beginning to end. And I guess I kind of wanted this to be that. And I guess you could just argue like you could just read the book, but it's like I also wish that existed in documentary form, I guess you could say. Like I kind of wanted like a deeper dive, and I kind of feel like this only scratches the surface. I was surprised at like how few of the cast members they talked to. Like they talked to Edie Falco, of course, and Michael Imperioli, and but I feel like there's like a lot of the cast members who are still with us. You know, obviously they can't talk to James Gandolfini, unfortunately, but like there's so many members of the cast they can still talk to that they don't like. Alex Gibney does not talk to at all. And I wonder, maybe you go into this with your interview with him, but I wonder if he interviewed more people and they just didn't like make the final cut or whatever. But I feel like there's a lot of more people they could have talked to, and I'm surprised that they did.
Yeah, he does address that, but doesn't really get into the why of it all. He says, and people will hear this soon, but he says that he didn't want to make this like the definitive kind of thing. He just looked at David Chase and the conversations that they were having as like his in for telling this story. So I can understand that, because The Sopranos is such a sprawling thing, and it's such an important landmark in the history of TV that, yeah, talk about an 8-hour thing. I mean, it would take a long time to create the version that you want. And I wanted that too when I was watching this. I wished that this had the room to go deeper and provide more stuff, because I've only watched the show one time, and I finished my first viewing of it, I think it was 2022. And since then, I have not done a ton of reading about it. I think my wife got me that Sopranos Sessions book that you mentioned for Christmas or something, but it's on my shelf and I haven't read it yet. So I have not done, any sort of deep dive analysis into the show. And so for me, I thought this doc was great because I watched it so much later than it originally came out. So I was so separated from the phenomenon of the show at the time. And I didn't watch it on the DVD box sets. I just watched it streaming on Max, I think. And so I've never seen any of the behind the scenes stuff. I've never really heard a lot of these stories before. So I wonder how this documentary might play to somebody who has been a little bit more immersed in Sopranos lore over the past 25 years. I'm sure you've heard all sorts of trivia about the show and like read about it and stuff like that. So how did this work for you since you did have that information, Chris?
Yeah, that's the other thing. There was nothing in here that I kind of didn't already know. So I do wonder if this is like a better docuseries for someone who hasn't been, for lack of a better word, obsessed with the show, or more of like a casual viewer. I don't know. Because like everything in here, I heard either through, osmosis over the years or from the Sopranos Sessions book. So it's not like the most detailed docuseries, but it is, if you love the show, it does a really good job of highlighting some really, important episodes. It gives you a better insight into who David Chase is as a writer and a creator. I do find it interesting that he was so interested in being a filmmaker. That's really, they sort of hammer that home in this over and over again, that what he really wanted to do is make movies, and that just sort of never really happened. Like he made what is that called, like Cemetery Row or something like that, or Graveyard Junction. I don't know what the hell the movie is called. I'm looking it up right. It's got cemetery or graveyard in the title.
I've never seen this. I don't know.
Oh no, that's a completely different movie. He made a movie called Not Fade Away. I'm thinking of a different movie, and no one like talks about that movie. And when they finally made a Sopranos movie, he didn't even like direct it. So it is kind of interesting that that's really what he wanted to do, and he never actually did it. I do find it interesting, and it's like maybe he's not cut out for that. Maybe TV is really what he should have been doing all along, as the Sopranos proves, and all his other history with the show.
Yeah, they mention Not Fade Away in the documentary. They're like really briefly, and they show, I think, like one shot of him working with James Gandolfini on the set of that movie. And then they just immediately move on. Like they don't get into that at all. And I remember being around and paying attention when that film came out and not really having the context for who David Chase was because I had not seen The Sopranos at that point. I've never seen that movie, and I remember it just kind of landing with a little bit of a thud or whatever and not really being a big deal culturally or anything. But did you ever see that film? What do you think about it?
No, I never actually even bothered to see it. It just
Okay.
did not look that good to me.
Yeah. But yeah, I thought that was notable that they brought up they did, as you mentioned, hammer that home, the movie thing over and over. And then they're like, yeah, he made one. And then they just moved on and didn't really get into it very much. But I guess they had a lot of ground to cover. What did you think about the structure of this 2-part thing? Because the first part of it, as hopefully people will know if you've seen it by now, is a lot of sort of backstory into David Chase's life and him growing up and all of that and like his early work. And they show some of his like thesis film and stuff, which I found very entertaining. And then they get into basically the creation of the show and maybe up to the first season, I think. And then the whole second episode is really condensed, rapid fire kind of, it has to tackle basically everything from season 2 until the end of the show. So what did you think about the way that it was structured?
Yeah, I like the structure. I did think it was an interesting approach to it. But again, I just keep going back to like, I wish it were longer, maybe like 3 episodes instead of 2. I don't know. I just feel like they could have gotten more out of it. I do, but at the same time, I do think that like it does a good job of not like dragging itself out. It doesn't like overstay its welcome. So I think it's pretty well structured overall. I just can't get beyond that fact that I wanted just a little bit more. And it's something that I want like them to talk about every single episode. I do feel like it cuts a lot of corners here and there. Like it does, like they very, very briefly touch on the fact that James Gandolfini had like substance abuse issues and just issues in general. I feel like I needed a little bit more of that. Like not to like, I don't want them to like linger on it, but I feel like it doesn't digest James Gandolfini as a guy as well as it could have done. But at the same time, it's not like a documentary about him. It's about the show, and it's more about David Chase than him. So I don't know. Maybe I'm like asking too much of it. I don't know.
Yeah, you could definitely feel people holding back when they describe that aspect of Gandolfini and like that period of the show and sort of how difficult it was. And you get these sense from some of the interviews with the writing staff that like the writer's room of The Sopranos was not the healthiest environment. And there was some like toxicity going on there, but they don't really get into the details of it. And I kind of found myself thinking like, well, if you're going to bring this up, like at least tell us the whole story.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure how reasonable that would be to request from somebody from a project that has David Chase in the title of it. You know, like maybe if somebody was making a Sopranos documentary from the true outside looking in, they could, I don't know, crack that open and get into that a little bit more than asking David Chase point blank, like, hey, why was your writer's room such a shitty place for people to work? You know, it seems like, I don't know, maybe you're like endangering your access and kind of taking it to a level that Gibney clearly didn't feel interested in going for this. But yeah, it sounds like you and I just want like another Sopranos documentary, maybe in addition to this one or something. But okay, so least favorite moments and favorite moments. Anything stand out to you in terms of a moment that struck you wrong or a moment that you really love seeing?
I don't have any like moments I didn't like. I did like that they point out the fact that like pretty much every writer on the show had mother issues, just like because that's like so baked into the DNA of the show. Like obviously David Chase has talked a lot about how the mother son relationship of the show is really based on his relationship with his mother. But they kind of point out that like every writer on the show had issues with their mother. I like how they go into the more they touch on like the more important episodes, the quote unquote important episodes of the show. The episodes that like there's a very it's really hard to watch. There's an episode where Dr. Melfi gets sexually assaulted, and they go into that episode a lot. I remember when I did my rewatch last year, I had a really hard time watching that episode, more so than I did when the first time I watched it. I don't know, like, just because I'm like older now or what. I don't know. I don't know how to explain, like, it was always upsetting, but it's a brutal scene. It's really unpleasant, and as it should be. Like, you shouldn't, like, you can't make a scene like that, not brutal, but it's depicted in this really unflinching way that I don't know if like they would show it like they did, like that they did back then. Like, just the way like sexual assault is presented on TV is so much different now. Like, in the wake of like I remember like Game of Thrones got a lot of like blowback for how it depicted sexual assault and stuff like that. So it's very interesting the way they go into that.
And they play the entire scene in this documentary, which I found kind of shocking.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I thought that was odd because Edie Falco, there's that one line that she has talking about that moment, and she was basically talking about, it seemed like the point that she was trying to make was the one that you just made, which is like, you have to kind of show the brutality. If you're going to depict an act like that on screen, in the reality of this show, you kind of have to do it the way that they did it. But Edie Falco also throws in this little moment of like, without a trigger warning, and like, that's what life is. And like, I don't know. I don't know if I fully agree with her mentality there, because she's like, that's life, baby. And like,
yeah,
we're watching a TV show. We're not actually experiencing real life here. So I don't know. I kind of raised my eyebrow at that moment.
Yeah, I agree. I did, like, not to disparage Edie Falco, but I did find that a little bit like, what's the matter? Are you triggered? Like, all right, we don't need to like rub people's noses in this. Like, and I'm not against trigger warnings. I'm not like 100% for them either. I do think there's like a place and time for them. Like, I don't want to make it sound like I'm like this, like, what's the matter, Lib? Are you crying? Because that's not, how I am at all. I'm very liberal in my views. I do feel like there is a sort of thing to be said for like art, making you uncomfortable. Like, but I also feel like some people need trigger warnings, and I feel like to like make fun of someone for that is a real dick move, for lack of a better term. Like, there's a place for it, and you shouldn't, I can understand pushing back against it, but I also feel like there's no real harm in it. Like, and if you get like really like puff up your chest about it, and you're like, what's the matter? Are you triggered? You just seem like kind of an asshole. Like, you don't need to do that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's a complicated issue. I kind of go back and forth on my feelings about it, but in terms of like whether or not they're warranted in all cases or whatever. But yeah, I ultimately end up exactly the way that you just laid it out there. So I wanted to mention a couple of the things that I wrote down just for favorite moments in this documentary. I love the Tony Sirico stuff about his hair, like him finally allowing them to mess it up in the Pine Barrens episode. That was just like a really entertaining little insight into that character. And I think I've heard some stories of that, like popped up on social media or whatever, like of, him being very fastidious, and like him being one of those guys that was, I think like he was like living a criminal lifestyle, years before he became an actor and stuff like that. So it's just interesting to hear about him and see some of those insights in this documentary. And then I really enjoyed the focus on Adriana's death scene, and how David Chase seemed like so emotionally linked to that character, or like he thought it was so fraught. Like, he had no problems with showing people die in the show, but that was the one character where he was like, yeah, it was basically like too much for me to even show it. So like the camera had to like wander away, and you hear a gunshot in the distance or something. So it was just interesting getting that sort of like personal look into what he thought about that. And then I was also really fascinated by the 2001 A Space Odyssey parallels in the final episode, where he's talking about Tony walking into his own POV. Like, I absolutely did not pick up on that at all when watching the show.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because I actually, like I've watched, like I said, I've watched the show in full like 3 times at this point, and the only time I notice him walking into his own POV is that final one where he walks into the diner and then he sees himself sitting at the booth. I have noticed that, but I never noticed all the other instances, and him pointing, and David Chase pointing that out like blew my mind. I was like, holy shit, I gotta go back and rewatch the show now because that's such a interesting. Like, I did not notice all the other instances. I just noticed that one at the end. So yeah, that's such a cool detail.
Yeah. Okay. Any other things that you wanted to mention about this doc before we take a break?
I do like how they talk about the end. Like, do we want to talk about the ending? What is your interpretation of the ending of The Sopranos, Ben? How do you interpret it? Because I don't think there's any wrong way to interpret it, but I do wonder, like, how do you read that ending? The infamous cut to black. I do appreciate that they pointed out, I think Drea DiMatteo says that, like, I thought my cable had gone out because I thought the same exact thing when I watched it live. When I watched it airing on TV, I remember I was still living at home with my parents. I watched it in my bedroom and it cut to black. And I was like, oh shit. Because I had like a really old TV in my bedroom. And I was like, my TV went out at the end of the show. And it's like, no, it's just like, that's the cut to black.
Yeah, I don't remember. I'm sure I talked about this a couple years ago on the podcast when I finished the show. And you and I may have even talked about it. But I think now the way that I think about it is because I knew what the ending was going into my experience of watching the show in its entirety. So I knew it was coming. And so I kind of don't have a read on like whether Tony died or anything like that right now. Anyway, maybe I did a couple years ago, but as I sit here and talk about it with you, I just kind of think that the show ends when it cuts to black, and I don't really fill in what happens after that. I just kind of view it as I think about it in the meta context of like, oh, that scamp David Chase, like that's where he's just kind of messing with us, and that is like kind of the totality of my emotional experience with the ending of the show right now as I sit here. So I don't know. Do you think about it in terms of like the story continuing in a different way? Do you think Tony was whacked, or like what do you think about it?
I'm right there with you. I think your reading is the correct reading. At the same time, I do think it's very hard to look at it and not assume it's Tony dying. I mean, even in this documentary, David Chase points out, like, there's that moment where they're talking about the Robert Frost poem and how black represents death. And then David Chase quickly says, like, oh, now they're going to say I'm saying he died. But there's even a moment in the final season where Tony and Bobby are talking about dying. And Bobby talks about, like, that's like when you die, you're not going to know what happens. And it's just going to like cut to black. And there's a moment where I think it's in that, it's not the same episode, but it's that same season where Silvio is out eating at a restaurant and someone gets killed right next to him. And he talks about how like he didn't see it coming. And it's like, it's very hard to like take all these context clues and not read it as Tony is dying. But at the same time, it's also like the show dying in a way. It's like the show has died. It's not just Tony has died. The show itself has died. And like the viewer is not going to go not going to go like the whole thing. Like when you die, it's the end for you, but everything else keeps going. And that's sort of like how I read it. Like the world keeps going, but you are gone, and like your time is over. And that's sort of like how the show is ending. Like the world will keep going on, but the show itself is cut to black.
Yeah, and I like what they say in the documentary too about like leaving people wanting more and maybe seeking out the answers in rewatching the show, and it forming a sort of circular pattern in that way. So I like that sort of the emotional through line of like you being left on this cliffhanger and not knowing the answer and thinking that maybe you can find some of those clues by going back into the show. I like as a creative person, as a creative idea, I like that as an end point of like rerouting people back to the beginning of the journey again. There's just something cool about that. So yeah. Okay. Well, and you mentioned Bobby. That's one thing that I wish this documentary got into more. I think that character is mentioned once. I really love Bobby Bacala in The Sopranos, and he is not mentioned really. I mean, I think they talk about him very briefly for like 1 second. And there are several characters that they just don't really get into at all. But I missed some Bobby stories. I really wanted them to dive into that. So that's part of what we were talking about, of wishing they had more room to get into some of this stuff. But okay, let's take a break and then we'll be right back. All right, Alex Gibney has over 100 producing credits, and his directorial efforts include films like Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, Taxi to the Dark Side, Going Clear, Scientology and the Prison of Belief, and the Elizabeth Holmes Theranos documentary, The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley, among many others. He produced and directed both episodes of the Sopranos doc, which I spoke to him about earlier this week. Here is that conversation with Alex Gibney. So before we talk about Wise Guy, I was looking back at your filmography and I noticed that you directed a Three Doors Down concert film almost 20 years ago. And that band was very much in my rotation for like a 3 or 4 year period right at that point. What was that experience like for you? I'm just curious personally.
It was interesting. I mean, I was approached by the manager, and would I do a movie about the band? And I didn't know much about them at the time, and they weren't on my playlist. But they were also known as very much as kind of a red state band, right? And so I was interested in them. So I hung out, we filmed some concerts, we shot on the road. It was just an interesting experience. Here's a band you don't know that much about, engage. So I did.
Yeah, I noticed that you haven't gone back to directing any concert stuff, since then. I was just curious if that was if that put you off from that experience, or you just weren't necessarily interested in that world.
Not really. I mean, I had produced a pretty big concert. It's a film called Lightning in a Bottle. I didn't direct it. Antoine Fuqua directed it, but I produced it, and that was something. And I did shoot some concert footage in the film I did on Fela Kuti called Finding Fela. There was a concert performed by Auntie Balas and the cast of Fela in Lagos that we shot. So it's not like I've never gone back, but and there's a glimmer of hope that I may do something next year, in that realm. It's kind of fun to do. And it's particularly fun to do in a way that's not what's super hard when you're shooting a concert is to figure out a way to persuade everybody involved to let you do what's necessary to do to shoot it as a concert, as opposed to just record it as video, as a kind of video package. Which is what is so often done with concerts.
Yeah.
The camera work is very uninventive. It's very safe. The lighting is also very high key. There are no shadows. So every concert feels very much the same. And the trick is to be able to persuade all those involved to let you change the lighting in ways that are better for the camera, to let you shoot in ways where the camera operators don't feel that they need to play it safe.
Well, thanks for indulging me on that. I look forward to hopefully that project coming to fruition and seeing what you can do with it. Okay, so getting into Wise Guy, there's obviously been a lot of coverage about The Sopranos over the past 25 years. So once you decided you were going to make this movie, how did you go about finding your way in?
David. I mean, that's the simple answer. I had lunch with David and everything opened up because I found him such a fascinating character and he had a really interesting story to tell. So, but the film, there have been comments, he could have or should have covered this. He could have or should have interviewed so-and-so or so-and-so in order to be more complete. But the film is not really intended to be a complete cover of The Sopranos. It's really about David Chase and The Sopranos, as the title says. And so everything flowed from David, that first lunch I had with him, and then ultimately the long interview we did that really set the project in motion. And everything grew out, all the branches grew out from the main trunk, which was the conversation with David.
How long did you have to sit with him on camera? Because that moment where he's talking about the verbosity and all of that was so amusing to me.
Yeah, that was scary. That was the first morning. It was really shot over 2.5 days, and we would do a morning session and an afternoon session both days. So that's a lot. That's like 12, 15 hours of interview.
Yeah. So how do you go about preparing for something like that? Like when you think about, okay, I've got David as my way in, I'm going to talk about The Sopranos as a show and its legacy and its connection to David, but I know that I can't be the end all be all Sopranos documentary. How do you, as an interviewer, go about preparing questions to sort of create a narrative for this story that you want to tell?
Well, in a way, I mean, I think in a way, the path forward is actually not to do an interview, but to have a conversation. Now, I prepare for those conversations, and sometimes I write lists of questions, but I rarely, and I will occasionally, if there's a camera break or something, I'll go back and think, oh gosh, I should have covered this, or we should go back on that. But honestly, the goal in these interviews is really to go with the flow. You follow the line of conversation, and instead of cutting somebody off after they said something interesting that suggests a possibility, say, I've got now question number two, you follow where the person you're talking to is going to take you. That's more interesting, I find.
Mhm.
Sometimes you stumble on territory you didn't expect, and then you explore it.
Yeah, that's great. So, were there elements that you wanted to address, but they didn't necessarily fit in the flow of what you were doing?
Well, if there were, I mean, I would find a way to go back around and get them. I mean, sometimes when you get to the end of a moment, the camera needs to change batteries or stuff, and sometimes I will say, let's change direction a little bit and get into this territory. So, so while there is a flow, there's also a sense of me thinking about what subject areas I want to cover.
Did you have any other interviews with other cast members or anything that were like left on the cutting room floor at all?
Yeah, there were a couple of interviews we did that didn't make it into the film. And there were other interviews that we could have done but didn't do. And why we didn't do them, there's no particularly good reason why. I think, everything sort of emanated out from David. And when David would suggest something, or when one of David's answers really suggested something, then we would reach out to, like, kept talking about, because I was focused very much on the two episodes that David directed, the first and the last. Both of them were shot by Alex Sakharov, and David, gave him a lot of credit. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Let's talk to Alex. And I think it kind of went that way. There are other people that, were hugely important to the overall success of the series, but they didn't fit within the kind of intuitive logic of the film as it was being unfurled, because we spent a lot more time at the beginning of the show, whether it's the first show or the first season. A lot of time was spent there. And, Matt Weiner, who's a hugely talented and successful writer, didn't come on so much later. So as a result, we didn't end up interviewing Matt. He's a fascinating guy and hugely articulate, but it didn't make sense within the context of what we're doing. And for films like this, for my money to work, you have to have a focus. And to the extent you start thinking like, oh my God, we got to cover this. Oh my God, got to cover that. Then you're creating a Wikipedia site, not really a movie. And so the movie at some point kind of tells you where it wants or needs to go.
You mentioned cinematography, and I was wondering what your process was to figure out what this film should look like. What kind of conversations did you have with your team, and when you decided to take this on, what kind of sprang to mind for what you wanted to do with this visually?
Well, I mean, we knew that a lot of the interview was going to be shot in Melfi's office, and that we wanted to some extent to find a way not that mimicked the show, but that paid homage to the show. Because there were certain things that we wanted to do and certain angles that we chose that were important, but that having that big window, for example, as a kind of a backlight, occasionally putting David in a kind of a silhouette, that felt right and true to our doc, but also felt like it was giving a tip of the hat to how they shot um, you know, the sessions in the episodes.
Mhm.
So so that was the kind of thought we gave to it. And you know, there were other fun things, but sometimes with something like this, where so much of what is going to be included is material that you find, you kind of end up, or I kind of end up developing an aesthetic along the way. Like we definitely had an aesthetic for how to shoot David in the Melfi office reconstruction, but everything else kind of evolved. And, you know, including the idea, you know, we thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to take David back to New Jersey? And then I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to put David in the seat of the car along with Jim?
Yeah, I thought that was a great touch. I love that.
Title sequence. And that took some doing to be able to, because we were able to go into the archive at HBO and find some of the outs. So we were able to put in some angles of Jim that had never been in the original title sequence. And then also worked very hard to shoot David in a way that would then intercut with the you know, with the stuff that was from the show.
Is that a trip that you make once and you get everything you need along the way, or do you have to have him in that car and you go back and forth a few times to get those shots?
We went back and forth a few times. But we got some lovely moments. Like we even, you know, when we passed through that toll station, you know, that's a classic moment. That's the toll station on the New Jersey Turnpike. We're just off the Lincoln Tunnel.
Yeah. So one of my favorite parts of this doc is how it almost puts us in the position of a casting director when we're able to see all these audition tapes and kind of try to discern the X factor that separates one actor from another. And I was wondering if there was a moment that was particularly revelatory for you when you saw any of that audition footage.
There wasn't a particular moment, but I think what was so exciting about it and the ability to include it and the fact that those tapes still existed was the idea that you're starting from it's the kind of the cinematic equivalent of starting from a blank piece of paper. In other words, you've got the script, but who's going to inhabit those characters? And you don't know. You have no idea. And maybe, you know, the casting director, of course, will make suggestions, but you have to experience those auditions in the moment, and you have to feel it, and then you have to imagine it, because you're just getting you're getting a very quick insight into somebody and their character and their ability, and of course, you know what they've done in the past. But it's a leap of faith, and it was super interesting to start from essentially the cinematic equivalent of the blank piece of paper. Like, okay, now who's going to be Carmela? Who's going to be Tony? That was really fun.
Yeah, that was a very cool moment. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you about the introduction of this doc, the beginning of part one, where you get into David's biography, and it's edited in this really unusual way where it feels simultaneously rapid fire and also incredibly sustained. And I was curious if you found that in post or if it was always the plan to cut it that way. What was that?
It wasn't always the plan. And I will tell you that, you know, owe a great debt to Andy Grieve for sort of intuiting that idea. It came out of the idea of that first day therapy session. You know, how do we convey the idea of both great enthusiasm and connecting and remembering this, remembering that, and free associating, and at the same time having these uncomfortable pauses where you're like, should I be saying so much? Should I, you know? So it was investing in a way in the kind of stream of consciousness of a therapy session, but at the same time also playfully mocking to some extent the traditional biography sequences of biopics, and doing all of that at once, so that because it was super efficient, but also it was kind of meant to lead you to that moment where David wonders, like, I've been talking my ass off. Why? And why am I telling all this shit to you? And I thought this was about The Sopranos anyway. So you think like, oh my God, is the whole movie going to be like that? But it leads up to that moment of revelation and a question like, I didn't know it was going to be about me. And that's when we cut to the title sequence. So that's one of those instances of writing the script in the cutting room. But we were invested in trying to get at that enthusiasm and also discomfort of therapy.
Excellent. Well, I'm out of time with you, but thank you so much and congrats on the project.
Thanks, man.
All right, that's going to do it for today's episode of the show. You can find more about The Sopranos at slashfilm.com. Chris has done a bunch of writing about the show. I'll try to link to a few of those posts in the show notes, so you can find those directly there. Slash Film Daily is published every weekday, bringing the most exciting news from the world of movies and TV, as well as deeper dives into the great features that you can find on the site. You can subscribe to the show on Apple, Overcast, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Send your feedback, questions, comments, concerns, and mailbag topics to us at bpearson@slashfilm.com. Make sure to leave your name and general geographic location in case we mention your email on the air. Don't forget to take a minute to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That really helps us out a lot. Tell your friends about the show any way you can. Thanks so much for listening.